I was the duty officer that Saturday and Sunday. And I received the call, it was in the afternoon, from Mr. Lundahl to get a crew in, better get a crew in, that the Secret Service was going to arrive sometime that evening with something that required some work at the center.
Timing?
Yes, they wanted us to time it. And Ralph Pearce said he didn't like that idea. If that's a Bell and Howell camera, he knew immediately that it was spring wound. And he knew that as it was projected, it would slow down. In other words, the timing at the beginning of the film might not be what you have at the tail end of the film. And I told Ralph, I said, would you write that down? And later I included that in the note that I sent to Lundahl. We had misgivings because we didn't know what the number of frames per second that he had set his camera on, or the tension that was on the wind-up.
I understand.
Perhaps the most intriguing feature of the entire Alvarez-Wyckoff experiment is this. At the time he undertook to study the film for us, Charles Wyckoff was unaware that there was anything unusual about frame 186 of the Zapruder film. He tentatively placed one shot there only because of Mr. Zapruder's slight jiggle at frame 190. Yet, in the Warren Commission report, we learn that, to a gunman tracking from the book depository, the President's head would have come into view for an instant through a hole in the foliage just at frame 186, where now appears something startled Abraham Zapruder. If a shot had been squeezed off there, a shot which missed, the length of time available to Oswald begins to stretch, even if the Commission's clock is right, for the Warren report placed the first shot at frame 210. But now that brings up a second question. Was the clock right? You'll recall that the Zapruder film is the basic clock for all of these events. Now, tests of the camera made by the FBI, a camera like this one, reported that it was running at an average speed of 18.3 frames per second. The camera had been obtained from the Bell and Howell Company, the manufacturers. During our CBS investigation, we asked the company if they had tested the camera's speed. The result was a public announcement that they had tested it, and the result was the same as the FBI test. And the announcement continued that they had that day donated the camera to the National Archives, and this is it. But if the clock was not exactly right, then the whole sequence of events, from the number of shots to the time span of the shots and many other things, would be affected. Curiously, most of the critics themselves accepted the 18.3 speed without question, except one, who insists it was running at 24 frames, as could have happened if the control had been depressed. Now, we decided to see if we could clock the clock. We turned again to photo expert Charles Wyckoff.
We have a clock over here with a sweep second hand, and if we photograph that clock with each one of these cameras, we will be able to measure the time that it takes to run through the few hundred frames as we've shown here. And I will try this for you right now. What I'll do is turn the light on to illuminate the clock dial, start the camera, and then start the clock and let it run for about a 10 or 15 second period.
And you do that with each camera?
We do that with each camera, and then we take the film out, process it from each record, and we end up with a result very similar to what you see on this chart right here. This corresponds to the first camera. This is the second, the third, the fourth, and the fifth. We started each frame here. We edited until we got the frame corresponding to 0 time on each one of the cameras. Then we counted off the same number of frames on each camera record that corresponded to frames 190 to 318 in the Zapruder record.
And there was this much difference in the cameras, although they were the same kind of cameras?
Same kind of cameras. There was this much difference in time. The first camera read 6.90 seconds, the second camera 7.30 seconds, the third 6.70, the fourth 8.35, and the last 6.16 seconds.
So under this theory, the shooter or shooters of the shots could have had up to how many seconds to fire?
They could have had, according to this, up as much as 8 35/100ths of a second.
This happened on the morning of Friday. That night, Cunningham, Killian, and myself went over to the Secret Service garage, and there was the limousine that they'd used. They'd flown it back. We examined it. We found some lead particles and scraping of lead from the inside the windshield. We took Zapruder's camera because he was photographing the car. And for certain distances, we wanted to know how fast the car was going. Well, we had nobody to ask. You had to figure it out. So Lyndall Schoenfeld took a clock that had a second hand in and photographed it with Zapruder's camera. And just like that, he knew exactly how many frames were exposed during a 10-second interval. We put that car, according to 3 people who were running movie cameras at the time, from Zapruder from head on, a lady from the left side, and so forth. You could triangulate and put the car in the middle of the street or a little bit to one side. You could put the front end of that car exactly where it was at any time, and with reference to when the shots were fired. And so that's what we did. I stood up there. We took Oswald's rifle with the scope on it to Texas and set it up. And there has been a conspiracy theories and people shooting from here and from there and from everywhere else. There has never been anything to indicate positively that anybody else was involved.
Dino Brugione saw a much larger head explosion that went 3 or 4 feet into the air above President Kennedy's head. He described the head explosion we see today in frame 313 of the Exton film as being low in the image. He said his head explosion was very high into the air, and when Dino found out that the present version of the Zapruder film only has 1 frame showing the head explosion, frame 313, he was astounded.
What I saw was more than that.
More. This is frame 313, so you saw more pink mist going up, straight up?
I remember the scatter was high.
Yeah.
You know, say 3 or 4 feet from his head.
Uh-huh. Up in the air?
Yeah.
Uh-huh. This is the only frame on the whole Zapruder film that you get to see.
No, there was more than that.
So you're saying there was more than 1 frame, for sure. How many frames do you think there would be?
I don't know, but all I know is that we were shocked when we saw it.
Right, right.
If you go down to the archives, you ask for the Zapruder film, they claim that that's the true one?
That's the true one, right. The one the frames that we just looked at. No? You're shaking your head. That's not the true one, is it? Is that what you mean?
I say the one that I saw, man, his head, it was way high off of his head.
Yeah. The debris.
And I can't imagine that there would only be 1 frame.
Right.
What I saw was more than what you had there. The further you get away from the original, you lose, and especially in color, you lose it very, very fast. You get away from 2 or 3 from the original, and you've lost a good portion of the information that you need. The idea was to give the Secret Service the best quality we could give them on the imagery that we were looking at.
Do you recall any image bleed over?
No.
Between the sprocket holes?
No.
Okay.
I've never seen that film like the night that I looked at it.
Were the images sharp or a little bit fuzzy, maybe?
No, they were sharp.
What was it that made you interested enough to dip into the Warren report to begin analyzing the photos of that day?
Well, I think it was probably that I had lunch every day with a bunch of my graduate students who were keenly interested in the controversy that was going on at the time. For a while, I couldn't get very interested in it, but then when Life magazine republished the frames from the Zapruder movie, I spent an evening looking at them, and I found something that excited my interest.
What first caught your eye, Dr. Alvarez?
Well, it's right here in the picture. At frame 227, the highlights on the windshield of the car are all drawn out into rather pronounced streaks. And you can see that in the frame ahead, the highlights are individual dots, and again in the frame beyond, there are individual dots. So something rather violent happened to the line of direction of Mr. Zapruder's camera in frame 227. It swung violently.
What does this finding mean to those of us who simply have followed the controversy over the assassination and are not physicists?
Well, to me it means that there were indeed 3 shots fired, as the commission said, that the one that apparently didn't hit anyone in the car was fired before the one that hit the president, and not between the 2 shots that obviously hit the president.
Just as a rough check on this theory, we decided to try it ourselves, using other cameramen holding similar cameras, standing on a rifle range, filming an automobile while a rifleman fired over their heads. These 2 volunteers are aiming their cameras at a parked limousine. Their instructions: hold the cameras as steady as possible and keep filming no matter what happens. The shots will come between them and the car. The cameramen are as far from the firing platform as Mr. Zapruder was from the 6th floor of the book depository. The reaction was obvious. The film taken by these cameramen showed the effect of the shots, despite instructions to hold steady. Even in steadier hands, motion was always noticeable. This frame shows highlight dots around the car's windshield. In reaction to a shot, the dots change to crescents. And in the following frame, they become streaks, comparable to streaks found on some frames of Mr. Zapruder's film.
And the film was an 8mm motion picture film, and the entire record in which the president was in view was represented on a film about this long, which only took about 10 seconds. And all of the records of interest were on this small piece of film. We actually looked at all the frames, but we only studied certain frames in detail. The reason for studying those frames in detail was the fact that there were certain little things in there that looked blurred at first, and we were quite interested in why they looked blurred. For instance, on frame 190 here, or rather, let's start with frame 189. There's a wall in the background with little holes that you can see a white building through those holes.
Well, that's a tile.
That's a tile wall, and you can see the little holes. If you look at it with a magnifying glass here, you see those are nice and round and fairly sharp. And yet in frame 190, right next to it, you can no longer tell that those holes are circular. They're blurred out.
Now, why is that?
Something must have happened to Mr. Zapruder when he was, something must have startled him when he was holding his camera. He had a camera very much like this model right here, which is an 8mm camera. And as he held it up to his eye, concentrating on the president, something startled him, and he jumped a little bit with the camera.
Not nearly that much.
Not anything like that at all, just a very subtle jump, but that was just enough to cause a blur of these little holes in here, and also a blur of highlights on the car.
All right, now you see that very clearly in frame 190, and that frame does look distorted, and you can't see the white holes in the wall across the street clearly at all. Now, how many times does that occur in this 10-second stretch of 8mm film?
Now, that occurs several times, as we've represented up here on this film on the wall. It occurs at frame 190. It occurs again at frame 227. Frame 227 was the next evidence that I had of Mr. Zapruder moving his camera. And it occurs at frame 318. Now, this is interesting because we all know that at frame 313, the president received the fatal shot He had a natural reaction time that he heard the sound at about the same time that something happened to President Kennedy when he was fatally wounded here. We can apply this same correction of about 4 or 5 frames to each one of these frames where I noticed motion. In other words, I'm saying that it was possible that there could have been a shot fired here, another one fired in this area of 222, 223, and another one in the area of 313, noticeable now in 318. I think the important thing is the fact that we have found an indication some 20 frames prior to the time the Warren Commission thought that the first shot was fired. Now, whether or not this was a shot, we cannot say, but certainly Mr. Zapruder, the photographer, was disturbed at that point.
Over the years, Tina's movie has been all but ignored by JFK researchers. In it, she captures the limousine as it turns from Houston onto Elm Street. More importantly, she may have captured President Kennedy reacting to the first shot that was fired that day, several seconds before Abraham Zapruder had even begun to film. Her film captured the limousine as it passed in front of the Daltex building, which was across the street from the Texas School Book Depository. As the limousine makes that turn, President Kennedy begins to wave to the crowd. But then something rather strange happened. He starts to wave to the crowd, but then within half a second, he pulls his hand back and balls it into a fist. Please watch closely and keep in mind that this is in extreme slow motion. Each frame lasts for about 1/18 of a second. And then something else happened that was pretty strange. The film was damaged, and approximately 7 frames were destroyed. It was during those 7 missing frames that President Kennedy fell sharply to his left. Because the frames were deleted, we aren't able to see it happen, but we can easily see him straighten back up. And this is not an optical illusion. Compare President Kennedy's motion with Jackie and the other people in the car. He's the only one who reacts this way. According to Gary Mack at the 6th Floor Museum, Tina Towner said that no one in her family knows when or how those frames were destroyed. So if Tina's family didn't damage the film, then it must have happened while it was in the FBI's possession. At the same time that Tina was filming his reaction, her father, standing a short distance further west on Elm Street, snapped a photograph which gives us a good look at the president's contorted face. Over the years, I've examined every available film to try to find one that would give us a better look at JFK's reaction then. I almost found it in the film taken by Robert Hughes, which also captured the limousine as it made that turn onto Elm Street. It was taken from a greater distance, but the original frames could be blown up and would very likely show JFK's movement then. But guess what happened? The film was damaged at exactly the same point in time that Tina's film was damaged. So it appears that the FBI destroyed frames in both the Towner and the Hughes films, which depicted the same fraction of a second in which President Kennedy reacted to that first shot. Now, if that wasn't done deliberately, then at the very least, it proves that they were certainly interested in those frames, enough so that they stopped the film to examine them long enough to let them burn up.
My name is Jack White, and I have researched the JFK assassination since 1963. My special interest is the study of photographs of the assassination. A shot rings out, and the president comes from behind a freeway sign. His hands go to his throat in distress. In the jump seat ahead of him sits John Connally, his right hand grasping his Stetson hat, until in frame 238, the governor's cheeks puff out and his right shoulder collapses as he is hit. Governor Connally screams out, "My God, they're going to kill us all." Mrs. Kennedy looks at her husband in stunned disbelief. and her left hand grasps his wrist. The gravely wounded Connolly turns to look directly at the president. The president begins to slump forward and to his left, and his wife bends to look in his face. Her face is close to his, and her arm is across his chest. Her left hand is on his right shoulder when suddenly the president's head explodes just inches from her head. The next frame reveals a massive exit wound of the right temple and forehead. Then a strange thing happens. The bright white frontal head exit wound begins to move around and change size and change shape as he falls toward his wife's lap. The entire forehead is shown to be missing, leaving nothing but a stump of head and a bright white blob where his forehead was. Back in the 70s, in my slide lectures, I began questioning the authenticity of these head wounds. My audiences agreed that these head wounds were very strange, especially since all other evidence indicated that the president's face was undamaged. I began wondering whether the Zapruder film was authentic. I was able to photograph the 313 limousine position from many important locations, such as Orville Nix's, and from the place where Mary Moorman is shown to be standing in the Zapruder film. Most importantly, I was able to photograph the limo, which is owned by Dallas tour operator Paul Crute, from the exact place on the pedestal where the Zapruder camera was located. Let me repeat that. Same limo, same 313 location, same Z camera location. All essential to this study, as you will see. But now, let's go back to the Crute limo as seen from the same place on the Dealey grass where Mary is seen in the Z film. Examining this slide, I discovered that the background differed significantly from the actual Moorman photo. Now, I'm among the foremost examiners of the Moorman photo, having studied numerous excellent copies of it for many months in the early 1980s after discovering in it images on the grassy knoll of a man in an apparent police uniform behind the picket fence. We called him Badge Man because of the badge on his chest. He is in a rifle firing position with a puff of smoke in front of his chin. Behind Badge Man, a man in a construction helmet is looking over his shoulder. Some 20 feet southeast of Badge Man, a soldier named Gordon Arnold is filming the assassination with his mother's movie camera.
On that particular morning, what happened was I came downtown and I thought there was going to be a parade. So what I did was I parked my vehicle back here in this parking lot, and I intentionally walked to this particular corner because I wanted to take pictures of the parade off of the railroad bridge. Well, this is about as far as I got, because what happened is when I got my leg to about this position, a man came around the corner off the bridge, had a suit on, and he turned around and he told me that I wasn't going to be there. And I guess I was younger and more spunky at that time because I told him, you and who else is going to keep me off the bridge? And he pulled out an identification card and he said, I'm with the CIA. And I said, well, that's enough muscle. I'll leave. So I turned around and I brought my leg back over like this. I walked down the fence line here about halfway. And I was looking over the fence to see if I could get a good shot of the parade. And he come back up and he told me, he says, I told you to get out of this area. And I said, okay. So I walked the complete length of the fence, got around on the other side. That's when I started to line up my frame so that I could take the picture of the parade. I had been panning shots through here so that I could get whatever was going to come down the street. And I saw that it was the President of the United States. And as I was panning down this direction, just as I got to about this position, a shot come right past my left ear. And that meant it would have had to come from this direction. And that's when I fell down. And to to me, it seemed like a second shot was at least fired over my head. There's a bunch of report going on in this particular area at that time. And what happened was that while I was laying on the ground, it seemed like a gentleman came from this particular direction. And I thought it was a police officer because he had a uniform of a police officer. But he didn't wear a hat, and he had dirty hands. But it didn't really matter much at that time because with him crying like he was, and with him shaking when he had the weapon in his hand, I think I'd have gave him almost anything except the camera because that was my mother's. And literally what the man did was kick me and asked me if I was taking a picture. I told him that I was. And when I looked at the weapon, it was about that big around, and I decided I'd let him go ahead and have the film. I gave it to him, and then he went back off in this direction. I went off in this direction. And 3 days later, I was in Alaska. Training that I had just finished, they were shooting live ammunition over us. And when a bullet goes past your ear and your eardrum feels like it's coming out the other side of your head, it's close. That's why I thought I was shot. There's no doubt in my mind that I was there. And it did occur.
He said he wanted to stand up here and take pictures, and would I stand behind him and hold on to him because he had a tendency to get dizzy on high places, especially looking through the camera lens. So he gets up here and I stand behind him, and motorcade comes around the corner and he's filming, and right up there at the first lamppost, it sounded like firecrackers, and the president throws his hands up, and I really thought it was firecrackers. It was like two firecrackers,
right.
Otherwise 2 shots, as far as I'm concerned. And I did not realize it was gunfire until the last bullet hit him right in front of us, and then there was no question because he was right in front of us and we saw the bullet hit his head and his head explode.
And you thought, my God, this can't be.
Well, no, I didn't think anything because your mind takes over at that time and you don't comprehend anything you're really seeing. It was mostly the next day when I saw the film when I actually realized what I had seen.
Were you with Mr. Zapruder when he then looked at his own developed film and realized what he had?
Oh, yeah.
What was the feeling that he had then?
I don't remember. I mean, I don't remember anybody else's feeling. I just remember mine.
What did you think when you saw the film?
Well, it was horrible. I only saw it that once and never cared to see it again.
Something you've pretty much erased from your mind.
That's right.
You are sure you heard 2 shots? That's interesting. We've heard conflicting
2 shots
reports.
And then the 3rd shot.
2 shots and then the 3rd shot.
Yeah.
So a total of 3.
Yeah.
And you're very clear on that.
Yeah. All from the same place, the same distance. The last shot sounded like a firecracker too, except it was right in front of us and I saw the damage it did.
You're not one that believes that a shot came from another direction.
No, especially the people who say it came from right back there. If it had been a high-power rifle that close behind us, both Mr. Z and I would have come completely off the colonnade from the sound.
So you're sure it came from that window?
Oh, yeah.
In that direction?
It all came from over our left shoulder. Now, where it came from, what window, I don't know.
Mr. Bowers, what is your present occupation?
I am Vice President of Lockwood Meadows Incorporated, which is a real estate land development company.
And where were you employed on November 22nd, 1963?
At that time, I was employed as a tower operator for the Union Terminal Company.
And where were you at about 12:30 that day?
I was at the south end of the terminal of the tower building, rather looking down toward the terminal and observing the motorcade as was everyone else in the area.
Could you tell us what you heard and what you saw from about 12 noon until the time that the shots were fired?
Well, for some time that morning, since perhaps 10 o'clock in the morning, we had the area pretty well sealed off, and the policemen had been stationed on the triple underpass as well as other strategic corners in the area, so that there was very little traffic moving into this area at this time. This is a dead-end area which is used primarily for parking. After 11 or 11:30, there was practically no movement in the area whatsoever. However, about 12:10, give or take 5 minutes, there was a car which entered the area and probed around for some time. This car was a 59 Oldsmobile station wagon with a out-of-state license. It was muddy as if it had just come in off of the road from some area where it was a red sandy area. It was occupied by one male who spent 3 or 4 minutes in the area looking it over, and then, as he found out, left by the entrance, which is the only way in and out of the area at that time. Not too long after that, perhaps 5 or 6 minutes, a car of a totally different description, also occupied by one male, entered the area. Now, this man performed a similar action, and he toured down around the area, probing to examine the exits, and seemed at one or more occasions to have a mic or something resembling such an instrument up to his face. Just a few moments after that, the third car came into the area, and these were the only 3 cars that entered this area during this specific period. The third car was a 61 or 2 Chevrolet. This car was muddy all the way up to the windows as if it had just come in off the road. It had an out-of-state license identical to the first car of the series, and it also had political stickers on it, which were not only for the same candidate, but were identical in nature and color, so that they appeared to have been from the same group. This car was occupied by one male who spent a little bit more time in the area than the others, and probed down by the side of the tower where I was located. I could not state that these cars left the area entirely, because after they got back onto the extension of Elm Street in front of the school depository building, they were lost to my vision, so that they could have remained very close by. Immediately after the shots were fired, of course, was mass confusion, to put it mildly, but the area was immediately sealed off by I would say at least 50 police within 3 to 5 minutes. The first one to appear on the scene, other than those who, of course, who were standing around, including 2 on top of the triple underpass, was one who rode a motorcycle up the incline coming up from the lower portion of Elm Street, and he rode perhaps 2/3 of the way up or more before he deserted his motorcycle. At the time of the shooting, in the vicinity of where the 2 men I've described were, there was a flash of light, or there was something which occurred which caught my eye in this immediate area on the embankment. Now, what this was, I could not state at that time, and at this time I could not identify it, other than there was some unusual occurrence, a flash of light or smoke or something, which caused me to feel like something out of the ordinary had occurred there.
In reading your testimony, Mr. Bowers, it appears that just as you were about to make that statement, you were interrupted in the middle of the sentence by the commission counsel, who then went into another area.
Well, that's correct. I was there only to tell them what they asked, and so that when they seemed to want to cut off the conversation, I felt like that was, as far as I was concerned, that was the end of it.
Mr. Bowers, how many shots did you hear?
There were 3 shots, and these were spaced with 1 shot, then a pause, and then 2 shots in very close order, such as perhaps almost on top of each other, while there was some pause between the first and the second shots.
Did you tell that to the Dallas police?
Yes, I told this to the police, and then also told it to the FBI, and also I had a discussion 2 or 3 days later with them concerning this, and they made no comment, other than the fact that when I stated I felt like the second and third shots could not have been fired from the same rifle, they reminded me that I wasn't an expert, and I had to agree.